So Hetty, welcome back. It's our second go at this. And I'm very aware that we've had volatility, uncertainty and complexity on our route to having this conversation. I'm not sure we had ambiguity, so that's good. One of the things I'm conscious of as we sit here today is how much has changed, even in our since that first attempt at an interview, because of the situation with Harvey Weinstein and so much going on that's throwing so much into the air. So I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation with you to kind of find out what your thoughts are on, what does the future of coaching, which is this amazing book you've read. I mean, you wrote. I absolutely love this book. I feel somewhat envious because I wish it was the book I wrote. But I'm curious about what is your take on what's happening when we start to look at it through the prism of what you've been talking about here. But to get into the conversation, perhaps you could just say a little bit about who you are, what's your journey to becoming the person you are that's written this book.
Goodness, you live long enough and then you get your bio gets longer and longer. So it can, what shall I say that's really, really relevant? Brought up in a single-parent household, and I think the relevance of that is twofold. One is I had a very close relationship with my mother, who was a survivor from the Holocaust. And so life was really to be cherished and relished. And I really inherited that love of beauty, that art enhances life. It's not an add-on. It's absolutely at the core. Poetry, art, beauty, joy, pleasures, the sensuousness of being alive was very important. Secondly, of course, being in a one-parent household, we had loads and loads of conversations. So the kitchen was the great hotbed, and we could be talking about, the best way to make an apple pie one moment, and talking about, Proust or politics the next. So that mix, I think, has really fed my own interests that, to put it bluntly and short, everything's connected.
Yeah.
Everything's connected. I'm not a fan of silo thinking. I think that our education tends towards specialisms, and that's good in some ways, of course, because it develops specialists and experts. But I think there's a loss there where we don't connect up the dots. And of course, life as lived is a smorgasbord, isn't it? We're moving from one environment to another, one idea to another, one piece of work or task to another, and then we move into our families and then back to work and so on. It's all connected. So that, I think, is very relevant. I studied history of art, and then that was after I'd done languages. So those all make their appearance in the book. So I did languages, history of art, and then I trained as a psychotherapist. Yeah. And that desire to go deep into what makes people tick lies behind the book, and it lies behind my love of coaching. I trained as a psychotherapist, but moved away from it eventually because of my... I wanted to work with people in the everyday context. Right. And the most... The biggest everyday context, if you like, is our work. We spend a lot of time at work, and how people can flourish, or alternatively feel very bogged down or trapped or despairing in their work is of great interest to me. And I think we should flourish in work. I think we should be, work should be an opportunity not just to discover what we're really good at, but who we are, and the legacy we want to leave and the contribution we want to make. Yeah. So all of that really, and that's what drove me or directed me into coaching. Yeah. And I've loved it ever since.
Great. And you also trained in the transpersonal tradition as well, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. What was it about that in particular?
The transpersonal appealed to me. It was a real moment of Damascus, the Damascus Road of zing, a real aha moment, as we say, when I discovered that finding out how people tick or looking at psychotherapeutic models didn't have to be focused on just the pathological, if you like. Right. The medical model, the idea that you're sick and I'm the expert who's going to come and make you better. What the transpersonal says is it views the individual within society. That immediately appealed to me, and it brings in art, literature.
Yeah.
It brings in a whole range of other inputs to give it a rich texture. And that appealed to me enormously. And I love the concept that the past is as important as the future, and the future is as important as the past and the present. So we're always looking to what are the links between past, present, and future. We're looking at the core of the psyche is both the capacity to be, and what the transpersonal might denote as the energy of love, and the capacity to do, our activity, the energy of will.
Yeah.
So just that's a brief, and it brings in what we might call the spiritual. The idea of meaning, purpose, what are we here for, what's our contribution, what's our sense of our own journey.
So one of the things, I mean, it's so beautiful to hear that, because it just really takes what I think coaching can be to that point of the whole human being. And I'm curious, one of the things I think you've tackled so brilliantly in this book, but I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is what are the conditions that exist right now that make coaching the thing that we are being drawn towards? What's happening in the world that you feel is making it such an important movement?
Well, you talked earlier about volatility, and it's actually quite an ugly acronym, but it's useful.
Yeah.
The VUCA acronym, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And that was coined by the military some time ago. I think it was in the 80s or 90s, to sort of post-Cold War, really, to describe the completely new state of play from the perspective of the military. And I think well, I'm not the only one who thinks it's a good descriptor of the kind of world we live in now. So things are not just getting faster, but they're getting more unstable. So the idea that we can look towards the great institutions as the marker, the standard for what's right, proper, good, legal, how things should be. That's gone out the window. I mean, we've seen scandal after scandal amongst, in the media, in the law, in politics, in education, in the church, and other faith institutions, where they've not just been found wanting, but seriously crumbling. And I think that throws us back on ourselves. It throws us back to have to say, so what are my values? How do I want to live? What is work all about? And what is my life all about? What does it mean to be alive today on this planet? And of course, the big one, talking of planet, is the awareness now, and I think it's very difficult not to be aware of this, that we have seriously damaged our home. And I think that raises a whole range of issues of fear, anxiety, guilt in some, confusion. What can I do? Surely we can fix this. Because we live in a culture, the Western culture is very much a fix it, cut it out or fix it society. And when we start looking at the issues that are involved in climate change, in the degradation and the destruction of the species, and I could go on, they're so complex that you pull on one piece of string and it starts to unravel, that many people just sort of give up and go, I don't know where to even start with this, or become paralysed. So I think what coaching can do, why coaching is so preeminently important right now, is it normalises a lot of these feelings. It can normalise these feelings. We work in the workplace, and I guess the big plea that I make in the book, or my case that I try to make, is that coaching can be so much more than just enhancing someone's performance in the workplace. That through the workplace, in the workplace and through it, people have the opportunity to explore what is my contribution really? What is my contribution both in the workplace and beyond it? And what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean? What does high performance actually mean to me? What do I want to achieve in my life, and so on. And these are big issues that I think coaches can really work with, so long as we stop being afraid of some of the dark stuff, darker stuff.
Yes, which we'll certainly come to later.
Yeah.
As I hear you talk there, I'm struck by the two-sided nature of that. On the one hand, you could think about what are the needs that the clients have that we as coaches respond to. But I'm also struck by what are the drives for us as a profession, what's making us do the work we're doing. and what's happening in society that draws us as individuals into the world of coaching. And if we take a moment to reflect on the coach rather than the client, what are some of the qualities that you feel the new coach, if you like, not necessarily new as a newly trained, but the coach for the new era needs to bring?
And I call them new generation coaching, not because I think they've suddenly sprung out of the rocks. Many master coaches, like yourself and others, have been around for a long time thinking about these things. I'm certainly not the only one thinking about these issues and these dilemmas. I think there are a number of qualities, but what I define are the areas of being able to think partnership rather than fixing. Coaches traditionally have occupied the sort of clean tech end, if you like, of the coaching profession. You know, we haven't really rolled our sleeves up, and we don't. A colleague of mine, Bill Sharp, talks about the capacity to stand in the compost heap of life with our eyes on the stars, and I just love that. And I really encourage coaches to get that. So partnership is one, which means thinking long term as well as short term. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do incredibly effective. Of course you can. 6 sessions, quick hits, fabulous. You know, a quick conversation by the coffee machine, fabulous stuff. But being open to a more intermittent, perhaps, and longer term relationship, I think, is important. To be a partner, you have to have that credibility. You have to have that. You know, you've trodden the road, you've gone the distance, you've climbed those mountains, you've got a sense of depth, you've got a sense of width and breadth in your own training, in your own experience. That doesn't mean you need to be an expert in either finance or law or engineering or food manufacturing, whatever area you work in. But I think having a sense of having travelled is important. The other thing is to think systemically, so that's the second element. Thinking systemically, seeing the client within their context. So being willing always to query, to question, to look broader. The third element that I think is very particular to the way new generation coaches are approaching their coaching is this concept of secular spirituality, which is what I call it. So it's less about having a sense of the numinous, the beautiful, the mysterious, something beyond, although that's very important, that, you know, when we're faced with life being this complex, we have to get comfortable with not knowing and comfortable with a sense of the mystery of life. But it's also very particularly about a sense of meaning, a sense of values, you know, and I really do think that in the face of the breakdown of many of our institutions, coaching is one place where we can reintroduce that conversation about values. What values do we want to live by, which is when values then become ethics. What are our codes of behaviour within this organisation? What do we stand for in life? And then the fourth element, the fourth dimension, if you like, that new generations that and this is very largely, it's a combination of observation, what I'm seeing. I always say, you know, you scratch a coach and you find someone who's deeply committed to meaning, purpose, contribution. So the fourth element is this sense of purpose, this sense of a journey, this sense of being committed to making a contribution to society or the global stage, if you like, beyond just the workplace. And I think those four, partnership, a systemic mindset, a sense of spirituality in the sense of values and mystery, and a sense of purpose, which is this sense of direction. Those are the four big domains. And then I outline 10 guiding principles, if you like.
And there's a couple of roles you pick up which I find really intriguing for the coach. And in particular, I like the idea of the coach as the fool, who can speak, you know, the truth to power, and the role of the coach as a kind of a canary down the mine, and the what you call, I think, the positive deviant. Is that how? Just tell me a bit about these unusual roles in a sense.
Yes, my purpose there, my idea was to help coaches think a bit more imaginatively about the possibilities of their role, and to be bold, be a bit more courageous in spreading their wings a bit. You know, we've become a bit comfortable with coaches playing small. You know, I'm just a sort of kind of technician. You know, so the fool has existed since time immemorial and in all cultures as the person who disrupts. It's a disruptor, really. The person who disrupts the norms. And there are many different roles, and they morph in different ages. I want, that the essay on the Fool goes into some of the history in medieval Europe and so on. This idea, for example, that there was a day of misrule,
Yes.
when everything was topsy-turvy, everything got turned upside down. I really find that very appealing, because it's a way of, as it were, letting the air out of the pressure cooker. Keeping everything structured and keeping those hierarchies and keeping those sense of everything in its right place, that sense of order that society needs, if you like, to survive, cultures create that, creates an enormous pressure cooker for the individual. Because the individual also wants to be free, wants to be a bit crazy, wants to go wild. The kind of image, many of my clients, if they're men, they sort of discover they've got a biker, with a sort of Harley Davidson hidden inside, or my female clients, a sort of rock chick or a kind of wild adventurer. We've all got that inside of us, and the idea that there should be a whole day or a festival when these could come out. But in terms of coaching, the coach can really help this person both discover the wild side of themselves, if you like, and then how to integrate it, how to draw from that wild part of themselves the best. For example, the quality, as you just said, speaking truth to power, to both the coach and the client can learn how to do that. The quality of having crazy ideas. Innovation depends on it, doesn't it? Creativity depends on it. The quality of looking askance, looking at things sideways. We get so used to our set tram lines. All of those are qualities that the Fool brings, and the coach themselves can both inhabit that.
Yes.
I remember saying to a client once, I just, right out of the blue, I didn't plan it, I just suddenly said, I don't believe you. I don't believe anything you've just been telling me. And it was so shocking that my client actually burst out laughing and said, no, you're right. And I said, okay, now let's put the truth on the table. What's really happening? And it was a great way of disrupting the norm. The other two roles you mentioned, one is the positive deviant, and the other was the
canary down
the
headless
line.
chicken.
So the idea of the canary down the mine came to me when I started reflecting on this this whole capacity we have to feel the vibes. And we talk, it's an old saying, it's 60s, isn't it, that you feel the vibes, but we all do it. We can go into a meeting, or we go into a relationship or a coaching session, and our guts are telling us something, but how often do we act on that? We often just ignore it. And by the same token, of course, we're radiators. We radiate, we set the field through our manner, through our intention, through the whole way we decide to show up. And so I was sort of exploring that, and as I mentioned, this client who was able to really pay attention to that. And I suppose what I'm keen to do is to encourage coaches to help clients move from being canaries in the mine. We all know what happened to canaries in the mine. They're the first to expire. And I think this happens a lot.
Right.
I think good people leave organisations all the time because they're just feeling the toxicity, if you like, and they don't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
And I think coaching can be an absolute critical partner in helping a client move from being a canary to, if you like, being a lightning rod. Actually seeing themselves, valuing that sensitivity, instead of saying, I've just got to leave. This is not a good place for me. Valuing that sensitivity and learning how to use it to good effect, both in their team and so on. Yeah. So that was the canary idea. And then the third one that you mentioned of being a positive deviant, I really, really enjoyed. And I have to acknowledge that the idea came from reading the work of Sarah Parkin, who is the director of the Future Foundation. But the original of positive deviance is fascinating. It comes from research done into nutrition in the 1970s. And what researchers noticed was that given the same circumstances of malnutrition or not malnutrition, of scarce resources and poor diet within, say, a village or a region, there would be a number of individuals who were thriving. And the researchers couldn't understand why. They all had access to the same limited supply of nutrients. And yet these people chose to do something very different, and they were thriving. And they became what these researchers call positive deviants. They deviated from the norm in a positive way, and gradually had the possibility, they didn't always, but became role models, if you like, for other people. You can do this differently. And I love this idea of being in a complex, difficult, maybe ambiguous, maybe even toxic environment, and being a sort of seedbed for change, if you like, being deviant, but in a positive way to sow change. And again, I think both the coach and the leader they coach can have the capacity to do that.
Which I guess comes back to your systemic notion that this is not just the coach doing something, but the coach paralleling and the client paralleling, and then hopefully the system doing the same in time.
That's right.
You know, one of the things I was talking to Peter Hawkins recently from Bath, and one of the things that Peter said was he felt the biggest contribution coaching had made to the world thus far was bringing emotional intelligence to organisations. And I'd never thought of it quite in that way, but I really like that idea that coaching is not so much the thing that happens just in that space, but the way it's changed the culture of organisations to be more emotionally intelligent. Yeah. Is that something you resonate with? Is that what you see?
Totally. I mean, you know, I still find myself going back to using this is not a plug, but one of the classic measures of emotional intelligence. I mean, my own, the one I use is the EQI, but there are plenty of others that are also very good, like Mesquite and the Hay one, because it's a great starting point. Because what you're getting there is, can we have a conversation? What kind of a conversation can we have? How do people manage stress? How do people make decisions around here? How do people interact with each other and, crucially, interact with themselves? Because, of course, that's the foundation. You know, how self-aware are they? Where can we go with this? And that's a great foundation for a coach to then take things further. So I would completely agree with Peter on that. And I would say, and I know that Peter would agree because we've had this conversation, the next stage, I think, for coaching now is to become the focal point, if you like, or the introducers of conversations around ethics, around, you know, Peter always says, where were the coaches during the banking crisis? And it's a good question. It's a provocative one, but it's a good one. Where are we while things are very tough? It's lonely at the top. We all know that. Leaders don't necessarily have people that they can really confide in, where they can express things like doubt or questioning or experiment with different approaches. The coaching space is the perfect space for that. It's a perfect space because it's a non-stigmatizing. We're not saying, oh, therefore you must be ill or you must, you know, you're not fit to be a leader. On the contrary, we're saying this is exactly what leaders should be doing. It's having these kinds of conversations so that when they act, they can act with a sense of confidence and empowerment of others around them. Because leadership is a shared thing. Leadership has to be a shared thing. At the very minimum, it's between leaders and followers, isn't it? There is no leadership unless there's followership. And how do we encourage people to be good followers? So, I mean, a lot of the book is about rethinking, rethinking what leadership is about.
It's very interesting. One of the things that Peter said on the flip side of that is after years of leadership development, the metrics seem to show that leadership's at an all-time low in terms of performance and in terms of how people respond to engagement with organisations. Do you have some sense of how those two can go hand in hand? The increase in emotional intelligence, yet the seeming failure of leadership development in some way?
Oh, I think it's absolutely connected, because I think as people get emotionally smarter, they're beginning to look around them and see the fallibility and the unfit for purpose type of leadership we've cultivated. And there's two essays in the book about leadership. The need we have now to cultivate what I call response-able leadership, responsible leadership with that hyphen, because what we've cultivated is the myth of the strong man. The Putins, the Erdogans, the Trumps of this world. Depending on your generation, the Clint Eastwoods, the James Deans, the John Waynes, and then now I don't know who the icons would be. But the idea of the quick draw, you know, the decisive, reactive, the strong father, the big hero who's going to save us all. This became very, very, or even the Messiah, you know, that they know somehow everything. They become the repository for everything, all our projections, all our need to be taken care of, our need for someone who's decisive, who's going to make good decisions. And it reached its absolute apogee, didn't it, during the 1980s, when one after the other we kept appointing these big guys, and they were always men, 99% were men, to run banks. And then they'd be found wanting and they'd be toppled off their posts, but they then went off with these massive share options. And it's very clear that that model is no longer fit for purpose, even while we still hanker after it. There's something very fundamental in the human psyche that wants, you know, a big daddy to take care of them. You know, it's our basic model when we're children, isn't it? But it's a very infantilizing model. It's a very sort of, in return for total care, if you like, we have to give up our freedom. Yeah. We have to give up our thinking. We have to give up our capacity for dissent. And we know that every good democracy, worth its salt, has to have the capacity to allow for dissent as well as consent. Otherwise it's not a democracy. And one of the problems with the big strong man image is it leads to autocracy, it leads to totalitarianism, it leads to a sort of all-encompassing, you know, I'm right, I'm the man. And what they say about Mrs. Thatcher, who was very much in the same model, so, you know, call it the strong man image, but there were a few women who fitted that image, that model, is that what happens is that everybody around that type of leader starts to second guess. They operate not from their own sense, which is what you need, because you need a whole raft, don't you, of followers who have different ideas, because that's what keeps it fresh and challenging and gives you different perspectives. But they were all starting to second guess what she would do. You know, would Mrs. Thatcher like this? You know, is this what she would do? Which then becomes de facto a sort of totalitarian type of regime, in a sense. You know, it knocks out democracy. And I think what we're beginning to prize, and that's why I say it's absolutely linked with the rise of emotional intelligence, is we prize authenticity. We're moving, we've got to move to the type of model of leadership that I describe in my book, which I call dynamic circle leadership, which is leadership sits in the middle, in a sense. It's a repository of energy which can be displayed in three different ways. Leading from the front, which is in a sense the energy of youth. It's a youthful, you know, testosterone dynamic energy. It's about going out there and making things happen. Leadership is also about supporting. So that could be the person who says, I think it's a great idea, I'd rather be in the back room, making sure the wheels are oiled and being the person that you can use as a sounding board. And then it's also about, we don't talk about this much, collaborating, which is the mature adult energy, which says, I'm the one who's going to say, hang on a minute, let's think this through a bit more, let's take our time. Or I'm the one who's going to be shoulder to shoulder with you when we go out front, and so on. And different people can occupy those different dynamics, if you like, or those type of roles at different times in different projects. When you've got a really good team, that's what you see. When you're a high-performing team, people move into different positions, like a football team, really. Except that people get stuck in different roles. And what I'm advocating is that there should be more dynamism.
Yes. The other thing you talk about in your book is the rise of the millennial generation, of course, within the workplace, and also female leaders, which I'm guessing fits into the shift in how leadership is done. What would you like to share around that side of things that relates to coaching? Well,
I really think that all of these things are connected, so that it's not just coaches are kind of deciding to become these new type of coaches. I think there's a lot of drivers in society, and millennials you've mentioned one, women again is the second one, and what I call the third actors, people who are entering their third act, perhaps baby boomers, or people over the age of 55 or 60 who are full of energy, full of, one hopes, some wisdom accrued through a long life, but may not have the same pressures on them to earn money. They want to contribute perhaps in some different ways. And I think together you find, when you start looking at the research on these three demographics, they all want very similar things, which I find very interesting. So whereas before, the agenda, for example, for flexible working was driven by women in the workplace around a very narrow concept of work-life balance.
Yeah.
It's now an agenda that's shared by both men and women in those three in the other two demographics, the millennials and the third actors, who are saying, you know, what is this nonsense about being at work from 9 to 5? You know, we no longer have a job for life.
Yeah.
Many of us have what are sort of called portfolio careers, or what I call patchwork careers, where one thing kind of feeds another. And there's what's that golden thread that ties it all together. Millennials, for example, don't want to work in the traditional workplace, a sort of glass and steel box. They want to work in cafes, and it's perfectly, nowadays with technology, it's perfectly possible.
Of course, yeah.
Startups happen in someone's back bedroom within a few hours. So work is changing, and millennials are riding that wave. They're also crucially saying, we don't want to wait till we're grey-haired before we become leaders. We don't want to wait till we're retired to have spend time at home. We want to bring up our children now and have meaningful work, and we want work that makes a contribution. So all of these things, I think, coming together, we're going to see a massive sea change, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, I'm not a soothsayer, I'm not a future person, but I do think that things are rapidly changing, and they will change the nature of work, and coaches will have to catch up. There was an interesting piece of research done by a researcher doing her master's at Oxford Brookes, and she interviewed coaches who were coaching millennials.
Yeah.
And the coaches really had to catch up. You know, millennials were chopping and changing appointments, they were saying, could we meet in the cafe, whereas the coaches were talking about safe space and all this sort of thing. And it wasn't that the millennials were right and the coaches were wrong. Sure. It was like a whole a new conversation had to take place about what was appropriate and what would be valuable. Because coaches want to be coached by those coaches who have travelled the course and, you know, are from older generations. So there's a fascinating lot of drivers happening. Yeah. And then, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning the whole sort of tsunami, if you like, that's happening around abuse and sexual harassment in the workplace. And I think this is also going to be, it'll feed into, I hope, women's self-confidence in coming forward saying the workplace has to change. Sort of hitherto, coaches have worked with women to try and help women fit into the workplace. Yeah. And actually it's the workplace that has to
switch
change.
Around, yeah. So one of the things I was conscious of as you were talking, Hetty, was the role of the coach and the role of the clients. But I'm curious about the role of the coaching profession. Like, one of the things I'm quite struck by is to some degree the extent to which the old professional bodies feel quite stuck. Yeah. To me, I kind of go, are they keeping up with where we as coaches are going? One of the things you talk about is the lack of a clear boundary between what some people might call therapy and some people call coaching. I'm just curious about your perspective on where does the coaching profession need to go, those people who talk about us as a profession?
Yeah, good question, and I do have thoughts about that. I think first thought is about boundaries. I think one of the things that we're looking at now is a blurring of boundaries, and that has good sides and obviously a downside to it, in the sense of living in a 24/7 world, you know, where there's what's happening 500 miles away suddenly enters our sitting room, enters our devices, and this can cause a lot of anxiety. But the good side about blurring boundaries is we're having to really rethink, and you see this, for example, with the debate around gender fluidity. And I think that's been fascinating. We're having to rethink some of the things we totally took for granted. Yeah. And I think the coaching profession needs to do the same. It needs to rethink some of the things that it took for granted. So what I consider slightly artificial boundaries around between counselling, psychotherapy, psychology, coaching, and so on. I think they are artificial because we're always dealing with the human being.
Yes.
And the human being doesn't have those sorts of clear compartments. It doesn't say, oh, right, I'm going to leave my emotions at home. You know, you were talking earlier, quite rightly, about the more emotionally literate workplace that we're now seeing. Well, with that goes the full package, you know, the full piano keyboard, the dark notes as well as the light. And coaches need to become much more fluent, much more comfortable in dealing with that whole piano keyboard. And therefore, I think coaching training needs to perhaps go wider and deeper. I think coaching puts us in an incredibly responsible and privileged position. Here we have people in leadership positions in large organisations or small organisations. They are themselves responsible for many people. How can we, in all conscience as coaches, go in with, perhaps a few weekends coaching training? It's just not ethical, in my view. I think that if we want to partner leaders for truly effective change and to support them in the many challenges, then we have to be much more skilled and much more, have greater capacity for what John Keats, the poet, called negative capability, the capacity to live with unknowing, with doubts, with uncertainties, with the mysteries, without what he said, irritably grasping after solutions. And of course, coaching traditionally is all about problem solution, goal fixated, and so on. And I think we need to have a more fluid, back to boundaries, a much more fluid sense of what this journey involves. And training needs to grasp that.
Let me come back to that training in a sec, but I just want to share something I read recently, which was a lovely little quote that said, I'd rather have a question that can't be answered than an answer that can't be questioned.
Yes, brilliant.
And I feel that's so in tune with what we as coaches, that phrase unknowing, or that word unknowing, is beautiful, because it's where we need to be truly unknowing rather than thinking we know, but acting unknowing. Which is very different, isn't it? To really be unknowing.
Yes. And there are some wonderful coaches. One immediately springs to mind, a man called John Matoney in the States, who talks about vulnerable leadership, the notion of vulnerability. It's good old Leonard Cohen. He said that's where the crack is where the light gets in. But we don't act like that.
Yeah.
We still, as coaches and as leaders, think we've got to be warriors going out there with our full armour and show that we know. And the demands, we are very affected by the demands of our people, whereas to be truly authentic, we have to have the capacity to answer to ourselves as a clear bell, and then to navigate, if you like, and negotiate with the demands of others. It's not a clear-cut one or the other.
When does somebody as a coach, or indeed we could move away from the word coach and something else, somebody who engages in dialogue, become competent to deal with the whole human being? Like you're talking about the training that's required, and I'm wondering, what is that? Like how is it about supervision? Is it about training? Like what's the journey that they have to go on to be competent to deal with the full human being, with all that kind of ambiguity of feeling that every human being has?
Well, I think you'd know better than me.
I want to learn from you.
Someone who runs a renowned training school. I mean, I personally think it's a lifelong training. I think that the trainings that I admire out there, and there are a number, I think are modular, so that, I think nowadays we can't expect people to sort of stop everything else and retreat into study. They're modular, but they're much longer term. I like the idea of doing a coaching training over a period of a year or even 2 years, where you come and go, and then you're then gaining, as it were, new lenses through which to look at your life and make sense. I think that coaches must be, to me it would be mandatory to have continuing professional development as a coach and to have supervision. I would encourage all coaches to follow their joy. So whatever it is, whether that happens to be sport or poetry or art or literature or dance or whatever it is that nourishes the well. There's a great guy called Dr. Alex Hill who runs the centre, who's the director of the Centre for High Performance, which is all about sport. And he gets them all reading poetry, going off, because it gets them out of their comfort zone, and they learn. Or they go off and learn how to dance or do yoga or something completely different. The idea is to do something completely different, and I think that is very important. That coaches must be encouraged to cultivate that richness of experience. One
of the things that came across from your book was just the sheer vibrancy, if you like, that you display about all things in life, whether it's art or films or books. Or there was a sense of like a real immersion into everything that is to be human, that's then being crystallized in your work as a coach and a change maker. And that feels so important to me, is that we become a whole person, not just a process manager.
Yes, well, I think you've said it beautifully, absolutely. You know, and we need more whole people
Yeah.
in the world, don't we? We really, really do.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, cards on the table. I mean, I think the world's not in a great place at the moment. It really isn't. And I think each one of us can do our little bit. And I think coaching is really, can become a really noble profession. I think we've sort of played small as coaches and in the coaching profession. And you mentioned the institutions earlier. I have no argument with the coaching professional bodies, if you like. It's often in the nature of professional bodies to be conservative with a small c. You know, they are the kind of guardians, if you like, of tradition. What gets dangerous is if they get stuck, and then they get kind of ossified and sclerotic, and they get rigid, and that's not helpful to anybody, is it?
Right.
So I hope that the coaching professions can also be encouraged to look at themselves and to really rethink regularly the way they accredit coaches and the kind of tests and measures that they use to do that. And keep that dialogue going. One of the great things I've always loved about coaching is its diversity, that it attracts people from all over the world, you know, and from all professions and from all backgrounds. That's a huge richness. And if we're really to honour diversity, then we really have to be open and honest about, I mean, how do you measure that? You can't compare apples and pears. You can't compare apples and oranges. You know, it's a different. So, how do we really honour that at the same time as having some core values and ethics that we stand by?
Yes.
And it's a dilemma. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I think grappling with that is what we should be doing.
It feels to me like the thing we need to move towards is a greater respect for the individual as a coach, not for the act of coaching, because nobody can be you as a coach, and they can't be me as a coach. Only we can.
That's right.
And so what makes us utterly unique is that what you would then call diversity. Diversity is only useful because it brings in difference, and that difference has got to show up in the act of coaching.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, why have it?
Absolutely.
And it's like, who are you as an individual that is utterly different from anyone else at some level that makes you the coach unique? And that feels that's you know, one of the things I take from your book is just the recognition of the complexity, but also the beauty of the fact that it is so big. It's not, you know, it's not just the grow model, it's not just the model, it's life.
Yes.
It's two human beings sitting down together, being present with each other and having a dialogue. And that feels like the heart of what your book really brings home to me. So thank you so much for writing it. It's been a pleasure interviewing today, Hetty.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.